Good evening. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Following President Biden's inauguration this week and the chaos in Washington the week before, the world's eyes are on the US. Here at the Union, we had our debate on the future of the US yesterday evening, and we're continuing the theme tonight with Howie Hawkins. Howie, thank you very much for joining us. I will just briefly introduce you. I'm sure I won't do you justice, but I will just so our audience have an overview. Howie is the co-founder of the US Green Party and the presidential nominee for 2020. He has played leading roles in the anti-war, nuclear and pro-worker movements since the 1960s. Hawkins ran as a candidate for the governor of New York, as well as the mayor of Sycamore in 2017, and has filed to run for presidency again in 2024. Howie, thank you very much for joining us. You're going to give us a brief speech now, I think for about 20 minutes, and then I will ask some questions. And then audience members, we have a link in the description below. So please ask any questions that you have for Howie below, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about the political situation in the United States from an independent, green, and socialist perspective. What the Democrats and the Republicans who dominate the system are up to, and what I think the left could do in this situation. Just let me correct one thing. I'm not a candidate for 2024. My campaign committee did file, as we had to do with the Federal Election Commission, because we're still wrapping up from the previous campaign and want to continue advocating our platform. But whether I'm a candidate or not is something that will be decided probably in a couple years. So I have to say, after Biden's inaugurated, it was refreshing not to hear big lies from the president. I mean, we've been through this. COVID was a hoax, it was going to disappear. The election was a fraud and stolen. Going all the way back to Trump's inauguration, where he had his spokesperson go out and say he had the biggest crowd ever for an inauguration, when everybody's lying eyes from the pictures told them otherwise. And so after 4 years of that, it was refreshing to at least have somebody speak, from reality. But I think we're still stuck in a political dynamic that's been going on for 50 or 60 years, where the Democrats are able to take the left for granted because it doesn't have an independent political presence, and chase the Republicans to the right. So the left is told to vote for the lesser evil, which opens the door for the greater evil. And there are progressive Democrats, Bernie Sanders and so forth, but they are basically the junior partner in a coalition with the corporate Democrats and really don't have leverage, particularly after this election, where they, as soon as Sanders was out, they united behind Biden and made no demands on him or no demands independently to the public in terms of a progressive program. So the Democrats, I think, have opened the door for the Trumpian Republicans, because the neoliberal capitalism of privatization and deregulation and so forth that they have put forth for decades now has led to declining living standards for the working class and the lower middle class, and economic anxieties for those that haven't been hit directly. And that is the fodder upon which the Republican right has fed on, mobilized their base on racist and nativist and conspiracy scapegoating, and an irrationalism that denies science. So COVID was a hoax, climate is a hoax, the election was a fraud, and a lot of people believe that. And so I think where we're at with the Republican Party right now is that Trump is out, but Trumpism is alive and well. And the occupation of the Capitol we saw on January 6th represents the hardcore of that Trumpian right, but a lot of people agreed with those people who thought the election was stolen and they were there to make things right. And there was a lot of note of the Republican donors, the National Association of Manufacturers and big Wall Street tycoons saying, their PACs were not going to support Trump Republicans after January 6th. But I don't think that will last, and they will continue to support the Republican Party for policy reasons. And the base of the party is this very far right situation. It's authoritarian. It's hardcore are white evangelicals. And this is a fundamentalist Christian right that is only 15% of the population, but it was 28% of the voters in 2020 and 40% of Trump's base. And so people talk about a new fascism in this country. It's really the old white supremacy. And when they feel they can't rule by elections, they get violent. We saw that during Reconstruction. And the Democrats in the South, under the slogan of white supremacy, violently overthrew Reconstruction governments. And then the populist movement got control of some governments down there, and they were violently overthrown. So we've seen this before in our history. And I think you look around the world, when the far right realizes it can't rule through elections and through the constitutional process, they get violent. We saw that in Italy, the socialists are gaining, the fascists rose. Indonesia, the alliance between Sukarno's nationalists and the communists was getting hegemony through the political system and elections. So the right slaughtered 2 or 3 million people to kill that movement because they realized they couldn't rule without it. That was a military right and an Islamist politics. And then in Chile, the Popular Unity government looked like it had a governing coalition, and the far right decided, well, if we can't rule through elections, we're going to have a coup. So I think that's what we're going to face here. Now, in this country, the military and the intelligence agencies do not back this. They still support a two-party system, but it's clear that our police and sheriff's departments are infiltrated by white supremacists. And there are these militias out there, which are actually illegal. Private militias are illegal in every state, but they've been allowed to exist. They're still out there. So we may see some violence as we go forward. And then, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party remains committed to this neoliberal form of capitalism. So they're socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. Domestic public austerity and an aggressive foreign policy. The issues that divide the two parties are cultural. They're race, immigration, abortion, but they largely agree on the economic and foreign policies. And I think what illustrates the weakness of the progressives within the Democratic Party is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has always wanted to get, since she was elected, onto the Commerce and Energy Committee, which would deal with Medicare for All proposal, a Green New Deal proposal, and a seat became open, and she, said she wanted to get it. The corporate Democrats recruited a conservative Democrat to run against her, and the Policy and Steering Committee, the leadership body, the Democratic caucus, voted 46-13 against AOC taking that seat. I think that gives you a sense of the balance of forces between progressives and the corporate centrists in the Democratic Party. So going forward, I think the prospects for the Biden administration really depend on the filibuster in the Senate. Now I'll talk about how I think Biden's modest reform program is inadequate to deal with some of these problems I've just described. But he does want to get some things done. But we have this filibuster rule where somebody can object, and it takes 60 senators, 60%, to vote for cloture. So the discussion is closed, and then you can have a vote. And right now, McConnell, the Republican leader, and Schumer, the Democratic leader, are negotiating an agreement similar to the 50-50 sharing they did back in 2001 with Daschle, the Democrat, and Lott, the Republican. And they haven't, or Schumer hasn't committed to one way or the other on the filibuster. But there are 2 Democratic senators that are opposed to getting rid of the filibuster. If it is not gotten rid of, then it's going to take 60 votes in the Senate to get any legislation that Biden wants passed. So this is going to be decided in the next couple of weeks, and it's something to keep an eye on. But I'm afraid, the Biden reform program is not going to deal with the economic hardships the working class, the lower middle class have been facing and made them vulnerable to appeals from the right. And on climate, you know, he's rejoined the Paris Agreement. He's got some initiatives, but, you know, given what the science tells us on how fast we got to reduce carbon, he didn't come anywhere close. And so I tried to run with my running mate, Angela Walker, an independent eco-socialist campaign, putting forward alternative perspectives. And we were blanked out by the media in this country, not just the corporate media, but the progressive and so-called independent media. We did get coverage in Europe and Latin America, but not in the US, except when we were attacked by our progressive public intellectuals for spoiling the election. And, you know, they would publish statements. We could not get our answers published even in the progressive media. So you can find it online, but it wasn't there. And these left intellectuals who are very prominent have moved to the right over the years. Back in 2004, when the dominant sentiment was anybody but George Bush, their relationship to the Green Party was what they called a safe state strategy. Vote for the Greens in the states where we know the outcome, what we know what it'll be, but in the swing states where it's competitive, vote for Kerry as a lesser evil. And I don't agree with that, because for us, every state is a battleground. We have issues, we need ballot lines and so forth. But that was, you know, understandable position. This year, they took a no states strategy. They said, vote for the Democrat, run up the majority. We don't care if the Green Party loses its ballot line, even in states like New York, California, Massachusetts, where Biden was ahead 25 to 30% in the polls through the whole campaign. So the problem is that unconditional support from the intellectual left and the organizations around the Democratic Party, the progressives, means that Biden can take them for granted. He owes them nothing. And so we ended up with 400,000 votes, not enough for Biden to worry about, but it is something we can build upon. And I think this surrender of our intellectual left to the lesser evil reflects a profound lack of confidence in a left program to fight the far right as well as the neoliberal center. And, you know, if the socialists really believed, the socialist intellectuals really believed that the best way to fight the far right is with a socialist program that can provide the economic security that we're missing from both the Democrats and the Republicans, they just didn't seem to believe that's how we gotta fight the far right. So we're in that dynamic I described earlier. So we campaigned on what we called life or death issues, the climate crisis, the growing and extreme inequality in this country, which kills. Life expectancy for the working class in this country is now in decline. And this is before COVID. Racism kills. We saw that with the George Floyd murder and a lot of, and we've seen that with the COVID epidemic. So a lot more people are aware of that. And then we have this new nuclear arms race where the bullets and the atomic scientists has their doomsday clock the closest they've ever had it to midnight. You would think that would be a major campaign issue. Never discussed. On February 5th, the last bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia on strategic nuclear arms expires. Wasn't discussed during the campaign. So we offered peace initiatives that I can go into if people are interested. But the point was to get to the point where the nuclear powers would negotiate complete and mutual nuclear disarmament and come into compliance with this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which 80 countries have now signed on to and is in effect for those countries. But the core of our program was the Green New Deal, which was both an economic recovery and climate program. And we put out a detailed budget. You can find it on our website, HowieHawkins.us. And it's really the only developed Green New Deal program in this country. AOC got a lot of attention at the end of 2018 when she was elected and was going into Congress for a Green New Deal, but the think tanks she, asked to come up with plans have only come up with concept papers. There really are no Green New Deal plans out there that if the Biden administration wanted to do it, which they don't, they could use. So we offered that, and it's, I think a shame that it really wasn't discussed. And so what our Green New Deal program was two parts: a green economy reconstruction program and an economic bill of rights. And the green economy reconstruction program was transforming all our productive systems, not just power production, but manufacturing, agriculture, buildings, and transportation, to zero to negative greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Because that's really what the science says a country like the United States has to do to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And it's a $27.5 trillion program over 10 years. And we say that's necessary because we're in an emergency. Like during World War II, this country, federal government took over a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country in order to turn industry on a dime into what they called the arsenal of democracy to defeat the Axis powers. We need to do nothing less to defeat climate change. So we say the climate investments that are being talked about need to be done through the public sector, where we can plan and coordinate, how you build clean public housing and integrate it with the transportation system, how you replace cement production, Portland cement, which uses calcium carbonate to heat it up. The calcium hardens the cement, the carbon goes into the atmosphere. That's 5% of the world's carbon footprint. So how do you get all those systems, those factories transformed in a decade? That requires planning. And what we're getting from the Biden administration are basically what we call here, and maybe you call their public-private partnerships. So it's incentives, not direct production. It's too slow and uncoordinated. It's actually more expensive because you got to account for profit rather than just doing it at cost. And it doesn't deal with the structural problem of capitalism now, which is, overcapacity. They're not profitable investment outlets. So when wealthy people get tax breaks and other incentives, they invest in financial assets, stocks, bonds, commodities, real estate, instead of new productive assets. And so that's a structural problem, because the Biden plan, which compared to our $27.5 trillion over 10 years, his is $2 trillion over 10 years, most of it incentives for private investment. And we're concerned that there's just not the opportunities there for private investment unless the government does what it did to a certain degree during the New Deal, and especially during World War II. And that is directly make things and directly employ people to do that. So that's the Green Economy Reconstruction Program. The Economic Bill of Rights is something that's been on our agenda since Franklin Roosevelt put it in his State of the Union address in 1944 and 1945. It was picked up by the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. And their concern was to provide universal economic rights to undermine the material basis for the white backlash that was being mobilized by the Goldwater Republicans and the Dixiecrat Democrats. And because we failed in the 60s to do that, the white backlash got in the White House with Nixon, with Reagan, and especially with Trump. And what we're talking about is a job guarantee, basically expanding the Works Progress Administration that we had in the 1930s, scaling it up so anybody who's unemployed can get a public job, a guaranteed income above poverty, built into the tax structure as a negative income tax, a housing guarantee. Our plan is to expand public housing by 25 million units over 10 years. That, and we can go over the figures, that will create an affordable opportunity for housing for everybody. Lifelong tuition-free public education, Medicare for all. And we want to socialize not just the payment through a single payer national health insurance program, but have a fully funded national health service that's democratically controlled by locally elected health boards. And finally, a secure retirement. Most people don't have more than Social Security. That's a poverty payment for seniors. So seniors keep working, they never retire. We want to basically double that benefit. So that program is about 1.4 trillion a year. And you add that together over 10 years, that's 42 trillion. It basically doubled the public sector, but we think that's what's needed to really deal with the economic and climate crises. And I'm getting close to my 20-minute mark, and I'm going to skip a section on how the Democrats took the Green New Deal slogan, diluted it, and buried it. But if you're interested, ask me about that. And just conclude by talking about, okay, we were totally marginalized in this election. What are the prospects for a green, socialist, independent left? And I think in this country, we have two ways. One is we have over 500,000 locally elected offices. Greens have elected or won 1,200 elections over the years. We have over 100 people in office now. That can be expanded into the thousands. And that is a foundation for getting into state legislatures and Congress and getting a political foothold in the system, despite the vote for one plurality winner system, which you have in the UK, which tends to force people to vote for the lesser evil and end up with a two-party system. The other thing is I think we have a real opportunity for electoral reform in the form of ranked choice voting or the single transferable vote like Ireland uses. And it's now in 38 cities and 2 states, 5 more cities or 6 more cities and 1 state in this last election adopted it. We can replace the Electoral College with a ranked choice national popular vote for president. So that would give room for the left, like the Green Party, to have a voice in these elections without being attacked for even running. And we can go for multi-seat ranked choice voting or the single transferable vote to get proportional representation in a multi-party system in the legislatures, from city council to Congress. And there are now campaigns in about half the states. I mean, they're serious. And I'm actually hearing from the progressive Democrats, prominent ones, who used to, kind of ridicule the Greens for even raising this. They would say, oh, we got a two-party system, we got to work within the Democrats. They are now realizing, I think, that they are stuck in a coalition with the centrists and they got no power. So now they're talking about it. So I think on an optimistic note, during Biden time, I think that's a serious reform that we can win in this coming period. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very, very much, Howie, for your speech and giving us an overview of the direction of the Green Party at the moment. It's very interesting. We've got a few questions from our audience members, and I have a few questions on several issues that you've raised. But just as a very simple question, first up, tell us, what's it like being a 2020 presidential candidate in a kind of day-to-day sense?
Well, day to day, it's putting out media releases, Twitter, Facebook, trying to get some coverage in the media. We know through our social media, I saw our emails touched, it was in the trillions in terms of all the emails we sent out and that were, sent out to various lists. We got millions on TikTok. We particularly got response from young people in their teens and 20s who would remix our stuff on TikTok and got as many views as 18 million. So we were able to reach people that way. But that was the main thing during the COVID period, sitting on Zoom, doing podcasts, meetings, and very different than before COVID. I was barnstorming and I spent half of every day driving across the state or flying across the country. And a lot more work for the people on the receiving end. They had to organize meetings. And so I actually think through the electronic means, we actually reach more people. But the big frustration was we had something to say. We should have been in those debates. If I'd been in that debate with Biden and Trump, I'd have had good things to contribute. And I would have focused on issues, not their, ad hominem attacks on each other. And I just think it's not a big deal for me. It's not a life or death thing for me, but for the body politic, the American people, they didn't get a debate in this election. It was all about Trump. What did Trump tweet or say on his way out to the helicopter? And then the liberal corporate media would be outraged and the conservative corporate media would be cheerleading. It was all about Trump 24/7. The whole thing was a referendum on Trump. Biden's main point was he's not Trump. And so all these important issues didn't get a hearing. So what it was like was frustrating. We thought we had something positive to contribute. And we never even got into the room to talk about it.
You talk about the frustrations of the election and spoken earlier about disunity and problems with violence that you've seen. In the campaign, talking to people, sadly not as much on the ground as you might have liked, but talking to people in whatever medium you did you have any cause for hope? Was there any moment you thought, there are some positives here?
Yeah, well, aside from the larger vote, I mean, I knew, and my campaign advisors say, don't say this, but I think I did because it's realistic. We were going to get a small vote, probably wouldn't affect the outcome, but that's not why we were running. We had three objectives. One is the way you get on the ballot in this country in 40 of the states depends on your presidential vote. So we were trying to preserve and expand our ballot lines. And because our vote was so low, we actually went from 21 state ballot lines to 15, which means we got to do massive petition gathering to get back on the ballot. The second thing was to advance our program. And while we didn't get into the Biden-Trump debate or the mass media, we did get it out on social media, and a lot of people were talking about it. And then the third thing was to recruit more people to the Green Party, and particularly among young people. And, in our conversations with them, it's like they hate Trump, but Biden doesn't have answers. And we like what the Greens are saying, so they're saying, keep going. And, they're fighting for their future on climate, on economic and educational opportunities, on racism. And, they want a real solution, not just, the lesser evil. So I think we advanced on those three. Well, we advanced on getting young people involved, certainly, and advancing our program through social media. The ballot line thing, we took some losses. So I never thought us breaking through. I actually, early in the campaign, for example, I'm the first candidate in this country to campaign for a Green New Deal. I ran on it in 2010. It was an economic recovery as well as a climate program back then. We're coming out of the Great Recession. I was running for governor of New York. And I was able to get the Greens to adopt a slogan, which I've been advocating for quite a while, because Caroline Lucas, Green Party of England and Wales, started talking about it in 2008. And then the European Greens took it up. And so the Greens here said, okay, I guess we can use the slogan. So, we've been talking about these issues for a long time. And I forget where I was going with that. I got off on a little tangent, but the original question was, what did we gain out of the thing? So, yeah, I thought, like CNN and MSNBC did presidential town halls on climate. Being the original Green New Dealer, we got as high as 5% running for governor of New York, which in a national election would be a big deal. It would qualify us for public funding for the general election in 2024. They might want to talk to me. If not in the town hall, how about a segment with this guy who was talking about the Green New Deal 10 years before the Democrats were? And, some reporters and hosts were interested, but the producers vetoed it. So I think I was disappointed that we didn't even get that kind of coverage.
Thank you, Howie. Just on this sort of topic of optimism and hope, what's your take on the Biden election? You've spoken a lot about how they need to go further on green policies, etc. Do you think that there is room for hope with this administration? Do you think we'll see material changes? They're probably not going to be sort of as much as you might like. Do you think there's opportunity to work with the Democratic Party in the next 4 years?
Well, I think there's some things we share, certainly with the progressive Democrats, like Medicare for all and a real Green New Deal. But I think their position within the Democratic Party, they don't have any more leverage inside than we do outside, frankly. I think on COVID, Trump set such a low bar, the Biden administration finds out they didn't even have a vaccine distribution plan. So they're having to build it from scratch. So obviously we're going to get improvements there. But when it comes to the economy, the economic stimulus that they're proposing, I think, is totally inadequate. I mean, we've had 25 million people lose jobs. Tens of millions of people face eviction or foreclosure when the moratoriums are up. Lots of people have lost their health care, which means demand is down in a capitalist economy. The profit opportunities aren't there. There won't be that kind of investment. I don't think the Biden administration has a clue to deal with that. And when it comes to the climate, they really don't have many details. What they did put in the Democratic platform, which came out of the Sanders-Biden Unity Working Group, one number they had was, we're going to retrofit 4 million buildings in 5 years, I believe is what the number was. Or maybe it was 5 million in 4 years. But there are 120 million buildings in this country. To complete that program, retrofit them for heat pumps and energy efficiency, at that pace would take 150 years. It's just not serious in dealing with the climate crisis. The Biden administration is committed to fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. They did stop the Keystone Pipeline, which is not a surprise. Obama had done that already. Trump reversed it. But we have other pipelines, many, many. You know, from the Enbridge Line 5, which takes Alberta tar sands to refining across mainly native land in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, to a whole complex of pipelines from frack gas. They're building a petroplastics complex down in southern Ohio and West Virginia, which is an environmental disaster. And all that's going to go through with Biden. They talk about net zero rather than zero emissions. Net zero, the fossil fuel industry loves that because you can keep burning fossil fuels. They talk about carbon capture, which isn't economical, but what carbon they have captured, they put in oil wells to get more oil out of those wells. And then they talk about nuclear power, which is very expensive. Biden went through the experience of subsidizing with loan guarantees 6 new nuclear power plants in Georgia and South Carolina. 4 of them have been stopped because of cost overruns and construction delays. There are 2 still going on in Georgia. They were originally supposed to cost $10 billion. They've already put in $20 billion. They're way behind, and they're only going forward because of politics. The governor of Georgia is a creature of Georgia Power and the Southern Power or Southern Company, which are building those nukes. There's just not a climate program there that's realistic. And the net zero, the other thing about net zero I was going to say is they will say, okay, we're going to have net zero because we may be burning natural gas in power plants, but we're planting trees that'll capture carbon. We need those trees to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. If 350 parts per million is a safety threshold, which James Hansen, our foremost climate scientist, has suggested, we're at 413 now. So we can't just stop putting greenhouse gas emissions out there. We got to draw it down. So net zero is not good enough. And you need to get to zero and then go negative to get back to a safe level.
Clearly, you sort of outlined some of perhaps the major difference between you and the Democratic Party is your approach to the private sector and how far you go in sort of pushing for green initiatives, and how far you go in taking that within the remit of the state. I'm sort of interested in this particular question. You're generally quite scathing about the private sector's ability to produce results in terms of tackling fossil fuel emissions, etc. Do you see any room for hope? Do you think the private sector, maybe in the technology sector, could lend a way out of the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think there are entrepreneurs, people that are more interested in the engineering, the technology, and the solutions than just getting rich. I mean, those kind of people are drawn, and they got to go to the private sector mostly. Those people are out there, and they've made enormous contributions. The cost of solar and wind have dropped off the table. I mean, they are the cheapest forms of power now, except for frack gas for power production, and they're competitive with that now. So yes, there's a role for those people. The public sector can hire them and coordinate their activities to get what we need on the time scale we need. And then, when talk about retrofitting buildings, you don't need a nationalized corporation to go out and do it all. You have, the public pay private contractors to install the heat pumps and to do the energy audits and the efficiency retrofits. So we're not saying the, public sector takes over everything, but the basic industries in manufacturing in particular, because there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions there. And, I mentioned cement production, take steel production. They use coke ovens. The industry's moving toward electric arc furnaces, which don't have the same emissions. But they're not going to move there until the coke ovens are worn out. As a private industry, as a public industry, they can plan to phase them out rapidly and go to the electric arc furnaces, because the objective there is not to maximize profits, but to get the result the public needs.
And on this topic of the economy and how we produce and consume, do you think the US is too decadent a society? Do you think people actually need to lead more frugal lives, or do you think it's possible to maintain the same standards of living and also tackle the really essential questions of the climate?
Over 90% of what we do, what we have a choice about, or really we don't have a choice about. If the roads are the main source of transportation and the combustion engine car is the main way you get to work and get your food at the grocery store, there's no way around that. If the housing being built is not energy efficient and powered by heat pumps and heated rather than by gas furnaces, you really don't have a choice. So we're not going to shop our way out of this crisis. Now, as we move to a sustainable, energy efficient society, there will be decline in measures of growth, like gross domestic product, which is a measure of all the money we exchange to buy goods and services. Well, if you're producing durable goods that last longer for ecological reasons, the GDP may go down, but your wealth remains the same because you have a usable product. So we may decline in the measures of growth as we count them now and actually have more usable wealth. So I think what we're looking at is different technologies and, design of cities and so forth, but it doesn't have to be a decline in living standards. Now, we do have a lot of conspicuous consumption. People buy big trucks. These pickup trucks, you could draw a big tractor trailer with some of these trucks. And that's totally unnecessary to go down and get your groceries. So, I think we have to have some standards in what we produce. And, and then we got to inculcate a culture of, just having a big truck doesn't make you a better person. And, that will be a challenge. But I think the key question is not the point of consumption, it's the point of production. And if we start producing production systems, goods, services, infrastructure that is sustainable, people will adapt to that. And it won't hurt that much. In fact, in a lot of ways, it'll be better.
Thank you for that. Let's move for a second away from policy, if we can, and onto the space of the Green Party in the political system. You've spoken a lot about electoral changes that you'd like to see, constitutional changes that you'd like to see. I have an interesting question from a student about what people who want to support third parties can do in the short term before that change is implemented. So Tara, who's a student here at Sydney Sussex, studies PBS, she asks, short of large-scale structural or electoral reform, what is the best way for citizens to support third parties without feeling they have a wasted vote? So maybe reflecting on the 2020 experience, what would your answer to this be?
Get involved in a local Green Party chapter and do two things. One is really organize. I mean, Greens in this country are activists. We show up at the demonstration, the public hearing, the letter writing campaign, the educational forum. But we tend to mobilize the usual suspects. We got to figure out how to reach out beyond our usual suspects. And that requires what we call deep canvassing in this country. You go out and have a conversation with people and mostly listen, find out what their concerns are, build relationships and friendships, and relate their concerns to the Green platform, certainly, but also be in the community so people can see you active on the issues. And that's how they're going to begin to trust. The Green Party is somebody that's for the people. And you can't do that through social media or regular media. You got to do it on the streets, in the workplaces, in the schools. That kind of organizing, I think, needs to be emphasized. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned in my talk, is we can win local elections, because what happens is most of these elections are in one-party districts because of gerrymandering, where they draw the lines to benefit incumbents. Most elections are not competitive. It's a Democratic district or a Republican district. Greens can come in there and raise real issues and win by going out and talking to the voters. The candidates from the major parties, they really never have to do that because they are designated by their party machines. And once they get through the party nomination process, if they're in a Republican district and they're a Republican, they're going to win. Or a Democratic district, the Democrat's going to win. We've had Democrats come to our group here in Syracuse, New York, who, were challenging the machine and got thrown out. We had a former firefighter and he wanted to go back into the city council. So he came to the Greens. And we thought, great, he's advocating our issues. And then he said, but you got to show me how to campaign, because I've never campaigned before. So I think there's a real opportunity for Greens. And that's why, we actually win a high percentage of the races we actually run, but it's in the hundreds. We got to expand that to the thousands and get a real political foothold in local government and from there state government and eventually the House. And I say eventually, we're running out of time on these crises, so we got to move fast. But I think that's where the opportunities are. We got to do year-round organizing, be active on the issues between elections, and then run more local candidates, and we can win those races.
Thank you. It's evident that your view is that the current Democratic Party is not up to scratch, and the Greens are the alternative there. I have an interesting question here from another student. His name is Lewis Gordon, and he's also at Sydney Sussex. And he asked that if Bernie Sanders had secured the nomination for president, would you have run as a Green candidate for president still? Or would you have supported Bernie?
Yeah, I would have run. Bernie's foreign policy and military policy was way short of what we need to dismantle this military and industrial complex and global military empire with 800 foreign military bases, 14 shooting wars where we have combat troops, drone strikes everywhere, special operations in over 100 countries. Bernie wasn't talking about that. And he wanted Medicare for All as a national health insurance program. We wanted a national health service program. We think they're good debates to have with them, even on the areas where we're going in the same direction. And in the Green Party, we have our goals that I mentioned, getting ballot lines so down ballot candidates can run in future elections more readily. Advancing our program and recruiting new members. Bernie's just one guy. Robert Reich, who's a fairly progressive man, was the labor secretary under Bill Clinton. And he wrote a book about his 4 years experience. And he called it Locked in the Cabinet. And, even if Bernie Sanders won the president, he might be locked in the presidency, given the larger power structure he's taking on. Now, he does understand that, and he said this a lot, we need a a political revolution with the people mobilized to back up the reforms. But it's going to take more than just electing somebody to president. We've got to, build, and I would say independent progressives, not just progressive Democrats. Oh, they will be allied on some issues. And in a multi-party system, well, AOC said at one point, in any other country, I would not be in the same party with Joe Biden. And she's talking about countries with proportional representation. So like I said, I'm pretty optimistic we can do that with ranked choice voting. And then maybe AOC will be a green in the future.
Thank you. We've got 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to move on to what is the elephant in the room, and that is the pandemic. My question for you is, what does the pandemic mean for climate change? And I have sort of two parts to this question. Firstly, do you see analogies between the climate crisis and the crisis we're facing with coronavirus? And secondly, does our response to the pandemic give you hope or cause concern about the way we might address the slow motion climate crisis?
Well, I think one parallel is we just had an administration with Trump that said both climate and COVID were hoaxes and really denied the reality. And so now we're moving into a new period where Biden, and I believe correctly, is treating the attack on COVID as, we got to put ourselves on a wartime footing, is the way he put it. And so there's going to be a lot of federal action that's needed to get the vaccines out, mandating masks, at least in federal properties, setting a different kind of example than we saw before. And that's good. I am worried that there won't be the same urgency for climate. And because we're spending a lot of money on COVID, including COVID economic relief, which I believe is way inadequate to the need, but the fiscal hawks are coming back. The Republicans are fiscal hawks when they're out of power. I mean, they run up deficits worse than Democrats do, and Trump was no exception with his big tax cuts. Now they're saying we can't afford it. And there are a lot of deficit hawks that have been brought into Biden's administration who agree with them. So they're going to say we can't afford to make the kind of climate investments we need to. And I would argue we can't afford not to. It will cost us much more not to address this crisis than to address it. Because where this leads is mass extinctions, ecosystem collapse, agriculture collapse, which is the foundation of human civilization. We're going to have a hard time feeding ourselves if the climate keeps changing at the pace it is, by mid-century, certainly by the end of the century. And we're already having that problem regionally in some parts of the world. So I don't know what's more expensive than that, the collapse of agriculture and civilization. So making investments now, even if they're high, big investments, is a good investment.
On those investments, climate change is seen as a medium to long term problem. But election cycles are 4 or 5 years in most Western democracies. How do you think we can sort of foster a sense of long-termism into our political systems?
Well, I think in the United States, we have this two-party system where it pays to go negative in a 24-hour news cycle. So the back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans, rarely on policy, it's just how bad the other people are. And so the debate doesn't even get to medium term, let alone long term. I'm no expert on other countries, but I do get a sense that they do have a longer time horizon than the United States does. I don't think they're adequate on climate, but they're certainly ahead of us in having those discussions. I think you just got to insist on it politically that, this is what we got to do in order to have a habitable future. And, You know, it's going to take more than one 4 or 5 year election cycle. And so that's got to be the platforms of political parties and candidates. And it's got to become part of the common sense of the political culture. So I think it's an educational process, probably. I can't think of institutional means by which you get long-term planning. If you want to keep democracy, a lot of people will say, well, China has a long-term plan. It's very autocratic, and they actually do have politics. It's just within the one party and their factions and their bureaucracy. And so, you know, their plans change too. So I'm not even sure that's, an answer to getting the long-term planning. I think it's really a matter of education and becoming the common sense of the populace.
Thank you. My last kind of major question on that is, I mean, do you think it's too late, or do you think we're approaching a point where it could be too late?
Well, we're going to have dire consequences given the climate change already in the pipeline, given the carbon in the atmosphere. But when I read some of these scientific papers like by James Hansen or Kevin Anderson over there in your country, they point to what we could do and then begin to pull back the carbon levels. So like Hansen laid out a scenario in a paper a couple of years ago. It's called Climate Change in a Nutshell. It's actually about 60 dense pages, but he summarizes, the science and lays out a scenario where we could get back to 350 parts per million by the end of the century and hopefully avoid some of these accelerating tipping points where you are beyond the point of no return. Like Arctic ice melting, instead of white ice reflecting sunlight, the dark ocean absorbs it. And so you're in a worse situation than just the ice melting, or the tundra melting and releasing methane, very potent greenhouse gas, as well as carbon dioxide. So, there are a lot of uncertainties. So, our best shot is what we should take. And, we'll just have to deal with the consequences that are already in the pipeline. But certainly it will be worse if we do nothing. So I don't think you ever pass the point of no return. You really, whatever situation you're in, you got to look at your options. And I think that's the way we should approach it.
If it's not too late, do you think the political system will wake up at the right time such that we can tackle the issue? I appreciate you might have to take your Green Party hat off for this point, but as a parting shot, do you think we'll make it?
Well, we like to say, I don't know if you say this in England, but in the United States, sometimes people say the highest office in the land is citizen. In the end, it's really up to the people. And so whatever the political structure and system, and whatever barriers they have to access and fair elections, even voter registration, it's really up to the people to stand up and make the changes. So you asked if the political system, that's kind of disembodied, it's abstract. In the end, it's the people acting together that, can make things better. So I think that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you, Howie, very much. Unfortunately, we're running to the end of our interview today, but thank you for taking the time to talk to us and answer our questions. Thank you to everybody in the audience who submitted questions. There were some very, very interesting ones there. Just as a final roundup from me, this is the last event of the week, but next week we have our Holocaust Memorial panel on Tuesday with some UK politicians, and then on Thursday we have our debate on government lockdowns. So please do stay tuned. Thank you all for listening, and take care.